All right, welcome to the first lecture for Architectural History 1301. I'm your guide, Riley Driggs, in case you don't know this by now. And today we're going to start to talk about your first reading, which is How to See, which is the introduction to a book that looks a lot like this, that was reprinted just recently. It was actually written way back in the 60s and published several times in 70s and 80s as well. Lots of nice photos, illustrations. Basically, this book is about developing visual literacy and understanding what we see out in the world around us. Written by George Nelson, who was an architect and designer, most notably in the 50s. Did a lot of work for Herman Miller, doing accessories and furniture, known for his work with the Herman Miller office design group. He developed several workstations that became staples around the world for modern offices. So one of the things that Nelson talks about in the article, in the introduction to his book, is that for better or worse, we live in a man-made world. And now we're facing the question of whether it will work any better than the Garden of Eden. And so, we look at the world around us, and it's undeniable that this is about a man-made environment now. This is not about living in nature. It's not about being in the trees, eating fruit off the trees. All of that stuff has changed now. Now it's a manufactured world. Now it's a man-made world, and it looks very different from what nature was and how we live more closely to it earlier on. And so what happened during the 1960s is that there started to be a reaction against this man-made world really invading nature and invading our environment beyond our city walls. And one of those things that really came under fire at the time were billboards. And this is something that Lady Bird Johnson, whose name is on the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center here in Austin, it became her most important really contribution to the world, because she saw that in America we're having this proliferation of advertisements, of junkyards, of dumps, and things all along our highways that really destroyed the beautiful nature that was around, that made driving a pleasurable experience in the countryside, etc. And so she really took on the advertising companies and wanted to make America a more beautiful place to drive through. So much so that she came under fire, obviously, from people who had a lot of monetary stake in this, and really, became a touchstone for what it meant to be able to enjoy nature in America. And so one of the things that Nelson did was put together this kind of informal experiment where he showed a bunch of people randomly collected images, photographs that he had taken and had gathered, and got their reaction to them. And one of the things that came out of this, highly unscientific survey, was that most people tried to make connections between the images in some sort of narrative way. Tried to make up a story, tried to approach it through words, and not so much looking at the photographs and understanding what was going on in the photograph. And what goes along with this is that people want to quantify things, and so measuring the amount of visual garbage out there, measuring what the effects of the environment are on people is really difficult to do. It's something that really can't be measured. I mean, if you look at a picture like this, is there any way to quantify, the effect of having the power lines run in front of the buildings over the road, causing confusion? Is there a way of quantifying how much signage becomes a problem? Is there a way to quantify, how beautiful a building is? How, what the positive values of an arch, say, are, or the positive values of having large amounts of glass that people can see to the street, and the street can see into the building and make some sort of connection there. And so what really is beautiful? What is what is a way of defining what ugly is? What is a way of quantifying beauty, or how we react to visual things in the landscape? So looking at different examples of things around, some people may find these images that I'm showing right now as being beautiful streetscapes, or maybe they're ugly streetscapes. But looking at something like this in particular, this is a wall that has been vandalized. It has graffiti. It's something that's not controlled. It's something that shows that maybe this area is not being taken care of. But if you look at it and you start to appreciate what's going on, where people have taken ownership of this wall, the community has become involved in what's going on in this wall. So there are pictures of upcoming events. There's art. There's lots of expression by the community on this wall. That maybe this is actually beautiful. Or is it? Or is it an eyesore? Is it something that needs to be done away with? Well, who can really say? I mean, who can really tell, especially in any sort of quantifiable way, that something gets to a point where this is ugly and we need to do something about it? Something like this, again, in the same sort of category, this is non-sanctioned art. This is graffiti. This is vandalism. But possibly in a setting like this, it actually enhances the neighborhood. It makes it better. It gives an outlet for expression. It communicates to the people of the neighborhood. And they're just, some really good renderings of these famous people. And it's some way of making a connection to the neighborhood. So is this bad? Is it vandalism that's against the law? Is it, outlaw artistry and artistic expression that should be encouraged? How do you actually go about thinking about this? Some people, this image of a colorful landscape, colorful streetscape is something that maybe a lot of people don't like. Maybe they're offended by bright colors. It becomes a very personal reaction. But there are some things that clue us into how good of a place this is, and we'll be talking a lot about place this semester. And how some of these things, although maybe not quantifiable, can be qualified and can be understood and talked about. A landscape like this, a streetscape that maybe not as pretty, not as taken care of, but still shows life, that still has interesting things going on. Is it as pretty as the other place? Is it beautiful? Maybe in its own way, maybe not. But again, that's something that's just hard to quantify. And then a place like this that is obviously well kept up, it's a place that has certain economic advantages, that has certain stories that it's telling by being here. But is it a very pleasant place? Is it actually beautiful? Is it some place that you want to be? Maybe yes, maybe no. And what about Las Vegas? Is Las Vegas something that's beautiful or ugly? Nelson asks us this question because there are a lot of things going on in Las Vegas, especially at night with all the signage, all the activity. It could be something that is seen as very beautiful because it's colorful, it's energetic. There's a lot going on that excite and stimulate the eye. But is it a really good place to be? I mean, would Las Vegas be as popular as it is if it didn't have gambling, if it didn't have this what stays in Vegas or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of mentality, would people still go to this place if those other things weren't there? Um, does the actual landscape of the place make it a desirable place to be? Again, with the signage, the kind of bizarre juxtaposition of having like New York with the Paris Eiffel Tower, um, balloons, Caesar's Palace with this Roman influence kind of stylistic bent all smashed together. Is this really a beautiful place? Or is it an ugly place because people are doing these things perhaps for the wrong reasons, or that it's more about the marketing, more about the advertising, more about trying to take people's money versus trying to create a great place to be, versus trying to attract people there because of the inherent qualities of the place itself. And so, what a lot of this boils down to is taste, and taste, stylistic taste, or taste and things in the built environment is again very hard to set against each other and to really understand what is better or what is worse. Taste is something that is acquired through experience. A lot of people don't have a great deal of experience looking at the landscape, looking at the environment, looking at buildings, looking at cities in a way that can start to inform them in any sort of way that their taste is developed enough to have a big impact, to make a lot of difference in choices that we're all making. And that's not to say that the unhighly developed taste of people is not important. It's just that if we don't have a lot of visual acuity and we don't understand what's going on visually, it's really hard to have discussions that are meaningful and productive. Just like if you were talking about any other subject that you didn't know a whole lot about. People talk about art in a similar way, where it's, I don't know a lot about art, but I know what I like. And it's kind of difficult going from that purely stylistic taste sort of mentality, because it all depends on what you've seen before. And if you haven't seen a lot, then it's really hard to have any sort of productive conversation. And so if we start to look at cities and our urban environment and the sprawl that is continuing to happen, that started back in the 50s and continues today as a response to the automobile and the growth of the United States in general. We look at this mega architecture around us. We're becoming less and less able to relate to what's going on around us because the scale is so great. And frankly, there's not a whole lot there either. It's just endless miles and miles of roadways with cookie cutter buildings, all sprawled out, and no real sense of place. These sorts of cities become non-places, in fact. And it's something that really affects us, and that we actually could do something about if we recognized it. And so, when we talk about literacy, when we talk about visual literacy, we're talking about decoding a language. That language is all around us. We may choose to hear it or not, but understanding it or not is something that we could all do better about. So the example of the Lone Ranger and Tonto looking at footprints in the desert, or hoofprints in the desert. They knew what they were looking for. They knew what that sort of language of feet in the sand meant, and they could decode it and understand how many horses there were, if they were loaded down, if they're going fast or slow. And that's all part of visual literacy, and that's something that you can apply to the environment around you every day. Now, talking about art, this painting is by Picasso called Guernica, and it's very abstract, sophisticated painting that is something that is beyond the decoding of most people who haven't spent any time looking at art or understanding the history of art or kind of how art works. It's just a very bizarre collection of images that is hard to decode in any sort of narrative way without having some sort of experience or understanding of what happens in art and what Picasso was doing, and how that all comes together in this painting. And so, there are a lot of messages here that we simply can't decode unless we've got the experience to do that. The same thing happens in our everyday environment. An example of Sherlock Holmes is classic. He's somebody who had a wide breadth of knowledge to draw on, and when he saw something, he could make connections between things because he had lots of experience and lots of knowledge kind of built in as he was looking around. And so, his knowledge of specific fields like chemistry, which was mentioned, allowed him to understand what the implications were of things that he saw. And so he could see a very specific thing in the landscape, visually make that translation and connection to the knowledge that he already had, and really interpret what he was seeing around him way beyond the kind of normal abilities that Dr. Watson had. And so he was always having to explain to Dr. Watson how he saw the world and how the things that he saw added up into particular clues and ultimately catching the criminal. And so what we're trying to do in this class is start to build that knowledge, looking at architectural history, to allow you to have that visual literacy to decode what's happening in architecture. And if you're so inclined, you're going to go on to architecture school, how to recreate that and how to translate that into your own designs that will be read by people out in the environment like you're doing now. So the more people understand, the more people see in the world. So if they travel, if they go to Europe, if they go to Asia, if they go to South America, Africa, places that they don't normally encounter, and they gather this wide breadth of knowledge, then they've got a lot more to draw on, and they're more flexible in reacting to new things that they see. So that experience, that knowledge that we're trying to gather here in this class about architecture and how the culture and the context and materials all come together to build something unique architecturally, is all part of that visual literacy. And so understanding how to see and how to look around you is something that's very important to start off with. The example that Nelson gives is the old saying about a cat may look at a king, but the visual message is more interesting if the onlooker also knows what a king is. And so if people are walking around all day as cats and they're looking at things, specifically buildings in our case, and they have no idea what a building is, then how interesting is it that they are looking at the building? How interesting is that relationship between themselves and the building? So it's just like a cat looking at a king. What does he see? Well, he doesn't see a king. He just sees something there that's moving around and has no real idea how to relate to him. That cat is not going to bow. That cat is not going to take orders from the king. Not that cats take orders from people to begin with, but especially so with the king, there's no difference because the cat simply has no understanding or experience with what a king is. And so going back to art and the painting example, um, people who understand art, who have been trained in art or been trained in art history and how to read paintings, will look at a painting in a much different way than people who just kind of show up on a Sunday afternoon to kill some time in an art gallery. Um, there are specific things to look for. There's again, there's the techniques, the context, the history of art. All those things add up to an understanding of what the painting is that goes beyond just what the picture is, that goes beyond that narrative that we all create when we see something, and it goes much deeper and becomes much more meaningful a connection to what the painting is. And so that's what we're trying to do in this class in architectural history, is that by understanding how these buildings got to be the way they are, in terms of the social and cultural motivators, the context in which things were built in, the materials that they were built out of, and the techniques that they were built with, all lead to a much greater understanding of what's going on. So that, again, in the event that you're going to go and be an architect, you've got a handle on what those techniques are and how they're employed, and you have that body of knowledge as examples in your brain as you come up with your own designs. Or even if you aren't going to be an architect, you just become much more visually aware of what's going on in the world and can make more informed decisions about the not only the built environment, but the environment in general, because you just have knowledge of the way it works, more than people who don't take any architectural history classes. And so the other example that Nelson talks about is this minimalist modern architecture. Why does museums show a cluster of 4 aluminum boxes as art? Well, this happens to be maybe the thing that he's talking about. This is Donald Judd, who is known for doing very minimalist artwork and installations. In fact, if you go out to Marfa, Texas, there are several examples of his work all over, and you can see his studio and get kind of a greater understanding of what he was all about. This is part of the Chinati Foundation, huge concrete boxes out in the landscape. And so, without any sort of cultural reference or artistic reference, somebody coming across these for the first time without that body of knowledge just doesn't have the tools to decode it. Just as if, you were dropped in the middle of a foreign country that spoke a different language, how on earth are you to relate to it? So it's very important to have some level of visual literacy so that you can decode what's going on with the visual language around you. Now the next example that he gives is about the Russians seeing some curated American art back during the days of the Cold War. And he uses this example of how people who don't have a lot of experience or knowledge in art think that painting is a kind of window, that you look through it and you see a scene like a bowl of apples or a battle or a portrait, but that isn't really what a painting is at all. That's just what a painting is of. It's about much more than that. It's about the shapes and colors and lines, how it's placed in the history of art, what the artist has done before, what the artist is trying to communicate, and all of that is what gives art its meaning. It's the same sort of thing that gives architecture its meaning. It's something that's very closely related. But the story he tells about the Russian and how we look at a set of mathematical equations that this is just the exact same thing as looking at art. We can see these things, we can read the letters and numbers, but we don't really necessarily know what they mean unless we've had a lot of experience in decoding this language. And so walking through a gallery might as well be walking through, a gallery of physics equations, um, unless you have some sort of experience and understanding of what's going on. So the other important point is that seeing this way is not a God-given talent. It's not something that you're just born with from day one. It's something that you actually have to learn. You have to go through experiences. You have to see things and try to decode them in order to understand what is happening out there visually. Um, and so, it's not so much a talent. It's not, again, this thing that you're born with, but it's a discipline. It's just like any other language that you have to work at hearing it, or seeing it in this case, decoding it, understanding the meaning, and then after you do enough of that, you can start to put things back out in the world. You can start creating art or architecture or anything else that fits into what's going on and makes sense because you know the language. Um, and he also talks about this idea of reading things, of reading something like a steam iron or a building, and understanding what it's saying to you. And so a steam iron to most people is just a thing. It's a utility object. It's something that makes fabric flat. But if you look at this thing visually, you can start to decode why it is the way it is. And so, why the handle is where it is and what shape it's in, why it's the color that it is, why the cord comes out the way it does. All those things start to give you clues as to how this little machine was built for doing things like straightening out fabric. So it becomes much more about what it does, but what are all the things that go into making what it is, and how can we understand it better by just looking at it, and getting all these clues like Sherlock Holmes and understanding what this thing is and what it means to us. This is what we want to do with architecture. We want to be able to look at a building, look at the setting that it's in, the urban environment, the landscape, and understand how it got to be the way it is, and why it's either good or bad, and have some sort of sense of understanding and meaning that it's communicating to us. And we're going to be doing this in terms of place, and the factors that go into creating a place as some sort of way of just gauging and filtering how we look at the world. And so, this looking at the world, this drawing on our experiences and continually testing what we think and how we feel about something, again, hopefully moves beyond matters of simple taste, and move more into an intellectual realm where we start to understand um, uh, more about what's behind things. And so, trying to decide, what's beautiful or what's ugly. This artwork by John Chamberlain, who's also out in Marfa and has a gallery out there. We look at this and we just see hunks of metal with bright colors on them. But if we start to look a little bit closer, we understand that they're parts of cars or maybe something else. And we start to look at the lines, we start to look at the color and how they interact. We start to look at the composition of how these things are placed. We start to look at where they are in the world, not only in the gallery, but the town that they're in and the environment of the town. And all of these things start to give us clues as to why maybe this is significant. Why is this relevant? Why is this not just a balled up hunk of metal that is really just garbage? This is just junk, right? It's just a bunch of metal crushed together. But the way that it's done, why it's done the way it is, can be read visually, and we can start to appreciate more about why it is the way it is, and it transforms from being just kind of a sum of its parts to something that goes beyond that and that transcends what you see in front of you into something that is artistic, something that makes us think about other things, something that makes us think about the world in a particular way that the artist wants us to think about. And so this language of vision has several characteristics. It has several parts of it, elements, that we can use to decode pretty much anything we see. It has to do with the light, shape, color, texture, etc. But the important thing is that you understand that this is a language. It's a language in and of itself that's separate from the verbal language, written language, mathematical language, other types of languages. It comes with its own set of rules. It comes with its own background and history, and it's something that you really have to practice in order to understand fully and employ it. So then what are we left with? Well, Nelson suggests that what we're left with is the reality of our varying abilities to use our eyes. What this takes us to is not any particular brand of truth, but rather the possibility of uncovering many levels of meaning. And so going back to the Vegas example, looking at these images of Vegas, we start to decode these things. We start to try to find meaning in what we're seeing. We're looking at palm trees. We're looking at the bright colors. We're looking at advertisements. We're looking at big buildings, small buildings. We're looking at traffic lights. All these things are indicators of what's going on in this place and how we should react to them. As Shakespeare says, sermons and stones and books in running brooks. All these inanimate objects that we create have meaning in them, and it's up to us to read them. We just need the visual literacy and the discipline to create that literacy in order to be able to understand what they're trying to say to us. So what we're going to be doing this semester is looking specifically at the architectural environment. We're going to be looking at history and how all through history certain forces have created these buildings in a certain way. We're also going to be looking at present day and trying to relate those things from history to here, to our current times, through the idea of place. And in the next lecture, we'll be talking more about place in the next reading, and starting to develop our definition of place and how we can use that as a language, as a decoding device for the visual language that we have all around us. So we'll be talking about place a lot this semester as we talk about the history and the development of architecture, not only as a means of shelter, but also as a way of communicating meaning that is unique to different cultures and contexts and material palettes. So until next time, I'll see you later.